Picture this. You're crawling through the freezing mud of central Gaul. It's pitch black. You're a messenger trying to slip out of the fortress to call for help. The grass ahead looks perfectly flat, a safe path to freedom. You take a breath, commit to the sprint, and plant your foot. Suddenly, the ground betrays you. There's no warning. Your leg plunges into a hidden pit, and a sickening crack echoes in the night. You haven't just twisted an ankle. You've stepped into a lily, a Roman engineering nightmare where a fire-hardened oak stake is buried inside a funnel-shaped hole designed specifically to shatter the shin bone of anyone foolish enough to run. Pain explodes up your leg, blinding and absolute. You act on instinct and try to pull free, but the hook shape of the pit only wedges your broken limb tighter. You're trapped, helpless, and then from the darkness 50 yards away, you hear the calm, rhythmic breathing of a Roman century. He doesn't need to fight you. The ground has already defeated you. This is the terrifying reality of the Siege of Alesia. It's not a battle of swords and shields. It's a slaughter by shovel and starvation that in 52 BC, Julius Caesar found himself staring at the impossible. He was deep in enemy territory, outnumbered, and his career was hanging by a thread. Confronting him was Vercingetorix, the king of the Gauls, a leader who had finally united the tribes and now sat securely atop the massive plateau of Alesia with 80,000 warriors. Vercingetorix had the high ground. He had the supplies. He had the numbers. He expected Caesar to launch a desperate, bloody assault up the slopes, a suicide mission that would end Roman ambition in Gaul forever. But Caesar did not attack. He looked at the mountain fortress and decided to rewrite the laws of warfare. He ordered his 50,000 legionaries to stop marching and start digging. If he couldn't beat Vercingetorix in a fair fight, he would simply delete the battlefield. The Romans began a construction project of maniacal proportions. They encircled the entire hill with an 11-mile ring of fortifications. But these weren't just walls. They were a complex death zone of trenches, diverted rivers, and those horrific hidden traps. Caesar wasn't just building a fence. He was building a machine to grind the Gallic spirit into dust. Vercingetorix, watching from the walls, realized the trap too late. He saw the Roman noose tightening and played his only remaining card. Before the circle closed completely, he launched his cavalry through a weak point in the lines. Their mission was not to fight, but to run, to ride to the corners of Gaul and summon a massive relief army. A force of over 250,000 men to crush Caesar from behind. Caesar watched them escape. He knew the clock was ticking. He knew a tidal wave of enemies was coming to wipe him out. Most commanders would retreat. Caesar instead did something insane. He ordered his men to build a second wall. This time facing outward, the Romans were now effectively trapping themselves inside a donut of fortifications, waiting to be attacked by 80,000 desperate men from the inside and 250,000 furious warriors from the outside. The hunter had voluntarily become the prey. To understand the magnitude of the disaster unfolding at Alesia, we must first understand the man standing on the ramparts. Vercingetorix was an anomaly in the chaotic tribal landscape of Gaul. Before him, the Gallic tribes were their own worst enemies, constantly bickering, raiding each other, and selling their neighbors out to Rome for silver coins. Vercingetorix changed the equation. He was a nobleman of the Arverni tribe who possessed a rare combination of political charisma and ruthless military discipline. He forged a coalition through blood and iron, famously disciplining wavering chieftains by cutting off their ears or gouging out their eyes. He demanded absolute unity because he knew exactly what was coming for them. By 52 BC, the Gallic wars had dragged on for 6 brutal years. The Roman machine seemed unstoppable. But just months before Alesia, something unprecedented happened. The machine broke. The site was Gergovia, another hilltop fortress much like Alesia. There, Caesar had attempted to crush the rebellion with his standard tactic: aggression. He tried to storm the heights, assuming the barbarians would shatter under the discipline of the legions. He was wrong. Vercingetorix used the high ground effectively, bottling the Romans up and launching counterattacks that threw the legions into confusion. For the first time, the invincible Julius Caesar was beaten. He lost nearly 700 men, including 46 centurions, the backbone of his army. The Romans were forced to withdraw in disgrace. This victory sent a shockwave through the ancient world. proved that Caesar was human, proved that Rome could bleed, and most dangerously, it convinced Vercingetorix that he had found the formula to defeat the empire. Refuse open battle, retreat to a fortified hill, cut off Roman supply lines, and let the legions break themselves against the walls. This success at Gergovia became the architect of Vercingetorix's doom at Alesia. When the Roman legions began to pursue him again later that summer, the Gallic king didn't flee into the deep forests or scatter his army. He looked at the map and saw Alesia. It was Gergovia all over again, but better. The plateau was larger, the walls were higher, and the water supply was abundant. He believed he was setting the same trap that had worked before. He would lure Caesar in, let the Romans exhaust themselves in futile assaults, and then crush them. Vercingetorix marched his 80,000 warriors onto the plateau with his head held high. He brought in the local population. He stocked the granaries. He prepared for a glorious defensive battle. He looked down at the valley and waited for Caesar to make the same mistake he made at Gergovia. But he failed to account for the adaptability of his enemy. Caesar was a man who learned from his scars. The humiliation at Gergovia had burned away any arrogance the Roman general might have had regarding siege assaults. Caesar looked at Alesia and immediately recognized that storming the walls would be a massacre for his men. He likely saw the ghosts of his dead centurions from Gergovia warning him against a direct attack. So when Vercingetorix looked down from the walls on that first day, expecting to see scaling ladders and battering rams, he saw something infinitely more terrifying. He saw surveyors. He saw engineers driving stakes into the ground to measure distances. He saw the legions laying out the perimeter for a wall of their own. Caesar had changed the game. He wasn't going to fight Vercingetorix. He was going to ignore him. The psychological impact on the Gallic forces cannot be overstated. These were warriors raised on a culture of individual bravery and single combat. They wanted to charge, to clash swords, to scream their war cries. Instead, they were forced to watch the Romans dig ditches. Day after day, the Roman line tightened like a constrictor snake. There were no glorious charges to repel. There were no enemies to kill. There was only the sound of 50,000 shovels moving earth, constructing a prison that would starve them to death. The order moves down the line. 50,000 shields are stacked. 50,000 pila are planted in the earth. In their place, the legions draw their delabra, the heavy pickaxe-matic that is as much a symbol of Roman power as the eagle standard. The tactics here are ruthless in their simplicity. If you cannot kill the enemy with steel, you bury him with dirt. The work begins with a speed that defies belief. These men are not just soldiers. They are the finest construction crews in the ancient world. Within hours, the green valley floor is ripped open. The first incision is a massive trench, 20 feet wide, dug specifically at the base of the hill. Caesar orders the walls of this trench to be vertical, not sloped. He wants a tank trap, a sheer drop designed to shatter the legs of any horse that attempts to jump it. Inside Alesia, the mood shifts from mockery to alarm. Vercingetorix sees the brown scar of the earthworks lengthening by the hour. He knows he cannot let the Romans finish this noose. He orders his cavalry to saddle up. They thunder down the slopes, aiming to butcher the legionaries while they are waist-deep in the mud. This is the first true test of the siege. A chaotic, swirling melee erupts in the space between the hill and the trenches. But Caesar has anticipated this. He unleashes his own secret weapon, Germanic cavalry. These are mercenaries hired from across the Rhine, savage horsemen who crash into the Gallic charge with ferocity. The skirmish is bloody and desperate. The Gauls are driven back, leaving their dead in the very ditches the Romans are digging. But the raid reveals a terrifying truth to Vercingetorix. The Roman line is solidifying. Once the main wall is finished, his cavalry will be useless. They will be trapped inside, eating food that his infantry needs. He makes a fateful decision. Under the cover of a moonless night, before the Roman ring is fully closed, Vercingetorix orders his entire cavalry force to break out. Thousands of horsemen silently pick their way through a gap in the unfinished Roman lines. They slip past the sleeping sentries and gallop into the darkness. Their orders are simple. Ride. Ride to every tribe in Gaul. Tell them their king is trapped. Tell them to bring every able-bodied man who can hold a spear. Come back and crush Caesar. Caesar wakes to the news at dawn. The birds have flown. He looks at the tracks leading away from Alesia and immediately understands the implications. The clock has started. The Roman legion is no longer just besieging a city. They are now the target of a massive rescue operation. Most commanders would panic. Caesar does not. He calls for his engineers. He points to the empty fields behind his army, away from Alesia. We have walled them in, he might have said. Now we must wall them out. The plan is expanded. The legions will not stop digging. They will build a second line of fortifications facing outward, creating a massive fortified donut. The army will live, sleep, and fight in the narrow strip between these two walls that it is a tactical insanity. A feat of engineering hubris that has no parallel in history. Let's take a walk through the kill zone. If you were a Gallic warrior trying to attack the Roman lines, you wouldn't just run into a wall. You would have to navigate a meticulously designed obstacle course of death. This is the Contravallation, the inner ring facing Vercingetorix, and it remains one of the most brutal examples of military engineering ever conceived. First, you face the trenches, not just one, but two parallel ditches, each 15 feet wide and just as deep. The inner one is filled with water diverted from the local rivers, creating a stagnant, muddy moat. If you manage to swim across that, you face the rampart itself. A 12-foot-high wall of packed earth topped with a palisade and battlements. But the wall isn't just wood and dirt. It's bristling with stakes. Sharp wooden points projecting horizontally to prevent anyone from climbing over. Every 80 feet, a 3-story wooden tower looms over you, manned by archers and scorpion artillery crews. But the true genius and cruelty of Caesar's design lies in what sits in front of the trenches. Caesar knew he was outnumbered. He couldn't man every inch of the wall at all times. So he built automated defenses. He turned the landscape into a minefield that didn't need gunpowder. Closest to the wall, we find the Sipi. Massive tree trunks buried deep in the ground with their heavy branches sharpened into points and interlaced. They look like the antlers of a giant stag. They're designed to hold you in place, to tangle your formation so the Roman archers on the wall can pick you off at their leisure. If you survive the Sipi, you step into the field of lilies. 8 rows of these funnel pits arranged in a checkerboard pattern. But there's more. Buried in the grass ahead of the lilies are the stimuli, the most insidious of all. These are simple blocks of wood with iron-barbed hooks driven into them, buried entirely underground with only the hook protruding slightly above the soil. Think of them as ancient landmines. You can't see them. You step on one and the hook drives into the sole of your foot. When you instinctively pull your leg up, the barb tears through nerves and muscle. A warrior crippled by a stimulus isn't dead. He's screaming, writhing on the ground, becoming an obstacle to the men behind him and a drain on the morale of his entire unit. Caesar's men planted thousands of these. They created a no-man's land roughly 400 yards wide. This was not a fair fight. It was a meat grinder. The Romans called these traps by innocent names. Lilies because they looked like flowers. Sipi meaning grave markers. It was dark soldierly humor. By the time the second wall, the circumvallation facing outward, was completed, the Romans had constructed a total of nearly 25 miles of fortifications. They had enclosed themselves in a fortress of their own making. The stage was set. The machine was built. Now it just needed to be fed. Inside the walls of Alesia, the enemy was no longer the Romans. It was time. Vercingetorix had calculated his supplies for 30 days. 30 days had passed. The relief army was nowhere to be seen. The grain silos were empty. The cattle had been slaughtered. Panic began to replace discipline. The Gallic council met in a grim atmosphere. Some chieftains suggested surrender. Others proposed a horrific solution: cannibalism. The argument was that they should eat those too old or too weak to fight to sustain the warriors. Vercingetorix rejected cannibalism. But his alternative was hardly more humane. He decided to purge the city of useless mouths. The elderly, the sick, the women, and the children. Most tragic of all, these were not strangers. These were the Mandubii, the local tribe who had owned this town, who had opened their gates to Vercingetorix and welcomed his army. Now, in return for their hospitality, they were being evicted from their own homes. the gates of Alesia creaked open. Thousands of Mandubii civilians shuffled out, carrying their meager possessions, moving down the slope toward the Roman lines. They wept, but there was a flicker of hope. They believed that Caesar would take pity on them. They expected to be taken as slaves, a terrible fate, but better than starvation. At the very least, they thought he would let them pass through the lines. They reached the Roman trenches and looked up at the legionaries on the ramparts. They begged for bread. They begged for slavery. Caesar looked down from his fortifications. His decision was instantaneous and icy. He was not running a charity. He was running a siege. Every mouth he fed was a day's rations taken from his soldiers. If he let them pass, he would lose the psychological leverage over Vercingetorix. Caesar ordered the gates to remain barred. The Mandubii turned back to Alesia, screaming for Vercingetorix to let them return. But the Gallic king, steeling himself for the battle to come, refused to open the gates. He could not afford to feed them. And so, the Mandubii were trapped in the no-man's land between the two armies. For days, the civilians wandered the killing fields. They ate the grass. They gnawed on leather and bark. Wives held up their starving infants to the walls, pleading with their husbands inside the city and the Romans outside. Both sides watched. The Roman legionaries, hardened men who had seen everything, had to stand guard and listen to the slow, agonizing death of thousands of innocents just yards away. The Gauls on the walls had to watch their families wither and die in the mud. Was a psychological torture designed to break the will of the defenders, but it also hardened the hearts of the Romans. By the time the relief army finally arrived, the cries from the ditch had largely stopped. The Mandubii were gone, reduced to corpses littering the obstacle course of Caesar's traps. The silence of the dead was finally broken, not by screams, but by the rumble of the earth. On the horizon, the standards of the relief army finally appeared. The cavalry arrived first, followed by a sea of infantry. The outer wall was about to be tested. The starving men inside Alesia heard the commotion and grabbed their weapons with shaking hands. The waiting was over. The apocalypse had arrived. The horizon didn't just shift, it came alive. The relief army, commanded by Commius and Vercingetorix's cousin Vercingetorix, spilled into the plain like a landslide. Caesar estimated their numbers at 250,000 infantry and 8,000 cavalry. Even if modern historians trim those numbers, the Roman legionaries were staring at a force 4 times their size. The ground physically vibrated. The shouting of the warriors, the beating of shields, and the blaring of the carnix, the terrifying Celtic war trumpets, created a wall of sound that drowned out orders. This was the defining moment of the Battle of Alesia. The trap was fully activated. Vercingetorix, watching from the citadel, saw the signal fire. He ordered his starving troops to throw open the gates. They didn't march out. They poured out carrying ladders, hurdles to cover the trenches, and a desperate, famine-fueled rage. For the Roman soldier, the nightmare had become reality. A legionary on the wall would fire his pilum at the charging relief army, turn 180 degrees, and draw his gladius to hack at Vercingetorix's men climbing up from the inside. The thin strip of land between the two walls became a pressure cooker. The first assault was a test of the engineering. The Gallic relief army charged blindly into the kill zone. The results were horrific. Horses impaled themselves on the hidden stakes. Waves of warriors fell into the lilies, their legs snapping like dry twigs, only to be trampled by the waves of men behind them. The Roman scorpions punched holes through the dense Gallic ranks. But the Gauls had numbers. They threw bundles of brushwood into the trenches to create bridges. They tossed earth over the hidden spikes. They were paving a road with their own equipment and their own dead. Caesar stood at a high vantage point, arguably the busiest man in the ancient world. He wasn't fighting. He was conducting. He watched for flags, listened for trumpets, and shifted his cohorts like chess pieces. Wherever the line buckled, he sent reserves. Nightfall brought no relief. Under the cover of darkness, the relief army launched a second massive wave. They brought grappling hooks and siege engines. The Romans, unable to see the enemy, threw their heavy pila blindly into the dark, aiming at the roar of the crowd. Inside the donut, The pressure was reaching a breaking point. Vercingetorix's men were tearing at the inner wall, filling the moat with earth and vines. By the morning of the second day, the attacks were repelled, but the cost was high. The Roman lines held, but they were thin. Tens of thousands of Gallic bodies littered the traps, rendering the stimuli and lilies useless. They were now buried under a carpet of corpses. The engineering advantage was gone. The Gallic commanders realized that brute force against the walls was failing. They stopped. They scouted. And then they found to the north. There was a flaw. The Roman lines could not completely enclose a steep hill called Mount Ray. Due to the rugged terrain, the wall there was on lower ground, vulnerable, and guarded by only 2 legions. The Gauls didn't just send a raiding party. They sent 60,000 of their best men to hammer this single crack in the armor. High noon. The sun beat down on Mount Ray. Suddenly, the hillside erupted. 60,000 Gallic warriors led by Vercingetorix charged down the slope, smashing into the 2 Roman legions defending the weak point. The exact same moment, Vercingetorix saw the movement and ordered a massive assault from the inside against the same section of the wall. The Roman defenders were caught in a vice. Labienus, Caesar's most trusted lieutenant holding the line, sent a desperate runner to his commander. "The line is breaking. We cannot hold." This was the crisis point. If Mount Ray fell, the Roman army would be split in 2 and slaughtered. Caesar sent wave after wave of reinforcements. First under Brutus, then under Gaius Fabius. They were swallowed up by the chaos. The Roman morale began to crack. Soldiers looked over their shoulders, seeing the ocean of enemies, and started to waver. It was then that Julius Caesar played his final card. He didn't send another general. He went himself. He grabbed the last few cohorts of reserves. Men tired, wounded, and scared. He called for his personal bodyguard and his squadron of Germanic cavalry. And then he did something purely theatrical yet psychologically brilliant. He donned his paludamentum, the scarlet general's cloak that marked him as the commander-in-chief. In the dust and gray confusion of battle, that spot of bright red was a beacon. Caesar rode directly into the melee. The effect was electric. The Roman legionaries, exhausted and on the brink of collapse, saw their general fighting alongside them. They saw the man who paid their wages, who knew their names, risking his life in the mud. The shame of retreating while Caesar advanced was too great. The line stiffened. The pila were thrown aside. Swords were drawn for close-quarters butchery. But courage alone couldn't stop 60,000 men. The Gauls were winning. They pushed the Romans back step by bloody step. What neither the Gauls nor the Romans saw was the ghost in the machine. While Caesar distracted the enemy front with his suicidal charge, his Germanic cavalry had silently circled wide around the back of the hill. Just as the Gallic victory seemed inevitable, a thunderous roar erupted from behind them. The Germanic horsemen smashed into the rear of the Gallic relief army. Panic is a contagion. In ancient warfare, an army is a beast that faces forward. When it's attacked from behind, the beast dies. The Gauls at the rear screamed and broke rank. The panic rippled forward like a wave. The warriors attacking Caesar suddenly felt the pressure from behind. The momentum shifted in a heartbeat. The Romans, energized by Caesar's presence and the sight of the enemy wavering, surged forward. The double trap had inverted. The besiegers were now the ones surrounded. The slaughter that followed was mechanical and absolute. The relief army didn't just retreat, they dissolved. Cut down by the cavalry, trampled by their own comrades, they fled into the forests. Inside Alesia, Vercingetorix watched the disaster unfold. He saw the scarlet cloak. He saw his cousin's massive army, his last hope, shatter like glass against the Roman shield wall. The noise of battle slowly faded, replaced by the groans of the dying and the cheers of the legions. The sun set on a field choked with bodies. The sun rose on a changed world. The plain outside Alesia was empty. The relief army had vanished into the forests, their spirit broken. Inside the fortress, the silence was absolute. There was no food. There was no hope. The gamble had failed. Vercingetorix convened his council one last time. According to Caesar's own commentaries, the Gallic king spoke with a tragic nobility. He told his chieftains that he had not fought for his own private gain, but for the liberty of Gaul. He acknowledged that they must now yield to fortune. He offered them a choice: kill him to appease the Romans or hand him over alive. They chose the latter. They sent envoys to Caesar to ask for terms. Caesar's response was brief and brutal: hand over your weapons. Bring out your leaders. He set up his tribunal seat in the fortifications, likely between the two walls that had strangled the rebellion. He sat there, not standing to greet an equal, but seated as a judge awaiting a criminal. What followed is a scene that has been painted, sculpted, and dramatized for 2,000 years. The gates of Alesia opened. Vercingetorix rode out alone. He did not come as a beggar. He came as a king. He wore his finest armor, silver and bronze, gleaming in the sun. His horse was groomed to perfection. He rode down the slope through the Roman lines and approached the tribunal. Historians like Plutarch describe a strange ritualistic moment. Vercingetorix didn't dismount immediately. He rode his horse in a circle around Caesar's chair. A final display of horsemanship, a silent reminder of the Gallic culture that was about to be extinguished. Then he dismounted. He unbuckled his sword. He stripped off his ornate armor. Piece by piece, the surrender transformed from a political negotiation into a physical stripping of power. He threw his weapons and armor onto the ground at Caesar's feet, and then he sat down in the dirt, silent and motionless. This was the moment of ultimate humiliation. Caesar did not speak to Vercingetorix. He did not offer him a hand. He simply signaled to his guards. The king of the Gauls was seized, chained like a common thief, and dragged away. Vercingetorix would spend the next 6 years in chains, kept alive for one purpose: to be displayed in Caesar's triumph. In 46 BC, he was paraded through the streets of Rome before a cheering crowd. When the procession ended, he was led to the Tullianum, Rome's ancient dungeon. There, in the dim light, a state executioner looped a garrote around the king's neck. With a quick, brutal twist, the resistance of Gaul was strangled. His body was likely thrown into the Tiber River. It was an unceremonious end for a man who had nearly brought Rome to its knees. But while Vercingetorix died, his legacy underwent a strange transformation. Caesar had intended to erase him, but by writing about him extensively in his commentaries to glorify his own victory, Caesar accidentally immortalized his enemy. He made Vercingetorix a worthy opponent to boost his own prestige, and in doing so, he preserved the name of the Gallic king for eternity. The Siege of Alesia reshaped the world map. Gaul became a loyal province. The Gallic aristocracy learned Latin, wore togas, and built bathhouses. Within a few generations, the distinct Celtic culture was absorbed into the Roman machine, creating the Gallo-Roman hybrid that would eventually give birth to modern France. Today, if you visit the site of Alesia, you will see a massive statue of Vercingetorix erected by Napoleon III in the 19th century. He stands tall, leaning on his shield, looking out over the valley where he lost everything. He's no longer a barbarian rebel. He is the first national hero of France. As for Caesar, Alesia was his masterpiece. It proved that Roman military engineering and ruthless pragmatism could overcome any odds. It gave him the wealth, the loyalty of his legions, and the political clout to overthrow the Republic. But there's a grim irony here. Just 2 years after he strangled Vercingetorix, Caesar himself would be butchered by his own friends on the Senate floor. The conqueror and the conquered met similar violent ends, consumed by the relentless grinder of history. So as we look back at the concentric walls of Alesia, at the hidden traps and the starving civilians, we are left with a difficult question. We often marvel at the genius of Rome, at the roads and the aqueducts. But Alesia reminds us that civilization is often built on a foundation of bones.